Good evening. This is The Digital Age, and I'm Jim Zirin. Tonight's show is about the way forward in Afghanistan. General McChrystal wants to surge American forces by about 40,000 troops. The president, after dithering over the issue for several months, is talking about a surge of 20 to 30,000 troops. Some are talking about a middle ground. The middle ground is undefined. Others want to pull out entirely. So our question tonight is, should Obama cut and run in Afghanistan? And here to discuss this issue with us is Stephen Biddle. Stephen Biddle is a senior fellow for defense policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was a member of General McChrystal's team, which was assessing the situation in Afghanistan. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Just to set the stage, we went into Afghanistan militarily after 9/11, and the objective was to oust the Taliban from power because they were harboring terrorists, and also to degrade Al-Qaeda. Now, we accomplished that mission. Mission accomplished. So why are we still there?
Well, because that outcome is now under substantial challenge. Arguably, if we had done the first mission right, it would not now be under challenge. But as a result of under-resourcing the attempt to create a government that could keep the Taliban out, it's one thing to remove them, it's another thing to keep them gone. We're now facing a situation in which a resurgent Taliban is reestablishing a challenge to the government that we created, and in the process creating some degree of threat to U.S. national security interests.
Well, did we only succeed in driving Al-Qaeda into the remote regions of the country and many of them into Pakistan, or did we actually seriously degrade them?
Well, I think we did both temporarily. By removing them from their base structure in Afghanistan and by killing some number of them in the process, we did degrade their capability quite a bit in the process of driving them across the border and into Pakistan. What we didn't do is complete the process. There was still a cadre left. It survived, and it's proven able to recruit and to some extent reestablish its former capabilities. All of that creates a new set of challenges now that we need to address 8 years in.
So we went in, and President Karzai ascended to power. He's a Pashtun. He purported to represent a coalition of interests, including warlords in Afghanistan, and that's the government that we're trying to stabilize. That's our new mission, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So is this a form of mission creep, or is this consistent with what we did initially when we went in?
I think it's mission change. I don't think it's mission creep in the sense that properly framed, our mission from the outset was or should have been create in Afghanistan a society that can control its territory to the point where it isn't a threat either to us or to its neighbors, and especially to Pakistan. That was, properly speaking, the mission from the time we began military action in 2001. We accomplished the first part of it. We did not accomplish the rest of it. We removed the Taliban, we kicked Al-Qaeda across the border, but we did not, in the process, create something that could resist their attempt to return.
But it's not only Al-Qaeda's attempt to return. There was a 35-year-old civil war going on in Afghanistan, isn't that right?
There was. Afghanistan had been at war since the Soviet invasion, and even in 2001 when we invaded, the Taliban had not gained complete control of the entire country. There was still about 15% of the land area of Afghanistan that was under control of Northern Alliance warlords that were waging an ongoing war against the Taliban.
Now, what is meant by the Northern Alliance?
The Northern Alliance was a collection of mostly Uzbek and Tajik ethnic militias under the command of a variety of individuals who used some combination of charisma and money to create military followers who were resisting the Taliban's attempt to impose Taliban rule over their own homelands in the northern part of the country. They were not a unified monolithic actor by any means, but they were geographically more or less contiguous and ethnically distinct from the Taliban, which is overwhelmingly Pashtun. And again, had been waging a war that had not completely ended when we intervened in 2001.
So Karzai is a Pashtun, the Taliban is overwhelmingly Pashtun, and there are other warring lords in the mix, is that right? Including drug lords.
That's right, and Afghanistan, unlike Iraq, is not primarily a war of ethnic or sectarian identity. This is not a war of the Pashtuns against everyone else. The government is run by a Pashtun. The Taliban that's challenging the government is a distinctively Pashtun organization. The war in Afghanistan is, at the end of the day, about governance ideology. Who's going to run the country according to what system of ideas about how a country should be run, not primarily which ethnic group should run the country.
So we inject ourselves into this stew, and what do you view as the strongest national security argument for our being there?
Well, there are two that the administration has articulated. Our interest in Afghanistan, in their view, is that Afghanistan not become a base for striking us and that it not become a base for destabilizing its neighbors, and especially Pakistan. The first is the one that gets talked about the most. The second is the one that's the more important. Obviously, Afghanistan can be a base for attacking us. It was in 2001, it could again. But there are lots of other places that could too. So could Yemen, so could Somalia, so could Djibouti, so could a dozen or more ill-governed spaces around the world. There's nothing literally unique about Afghanistan as a potential base for al-Qaeda to attack us. What is literally unique about Afghanistan is its effect on Pakistan. It's immediately contiguous. It's right across an ill-defined border in the form of the Durand Line. And whatever you think of the U.S. national interests at stake in Afghanistan qua Afghanistan, Pakistan is a place where there are very, very serious central U.S. national security interests engaged.
Pakistan has nuclear weapons.
They have a real, live, honest-to-goodness usable nuclear arsenal. They have a real, live, honest-to-goodness war on their hands, an internal insurgency aimed at toppling the government in Islamabad. They have a deeply
with the insurgents getting control of the nuclear weapons.
And that's the central threat to U.S. interests in all of South Asia, is if this insurgency succeeds in toppling the Pakistani government and the Pakistani nuclear arsenal breaches containment, that's one of the very few ways I can think of that Osama bin Laden could actually get his hands on a usable nuclear weapon.
And to be used possibly against India and China, as well as the United States, or United States allies.
Any collection of actors against whom Osama bin Laden sees casus belli.
Now, casus belli, an occasion for war. Yes. So you're of course familiar with the State Department officer who was serving in Afghanistan recently, Matthew Ho, who resigned, and he said, we're there as occupiers, we're resented, and our very presence in Afghanistan contributes to destabilizing Pakistan. Do you agree with him?
Many people do. I don't. I think Ho gave tremendously good and important service to the nation, for which we should all be grateful, but I don't necessarily agree with his assessment of the situation. Clearly, other things being equal, Afghans don't like a foreign military presence. Who would? I mean, we wouldn't like it in New York. But everything isn't equal. What we've had in Afghanistan since 2001 is a situation in which there is a foreign military presence that's large enough to be disruptive and unwelcome, but too small to provide what the population actually most wants and needs, which is security against threat. So we've got the worst of both worlds. If our presence were large enough to provide something in exchange for its disruptiveness, to actually provide the security that Afghan civilians want above all else, I think there's evidence from other places to suggest that that presence would be tolerated. If it's large enough to be annoying, but not large enough to give people what they want, I think the result is going to be a steady decay in Afghans' willingness to tolerate that foreign presence.
Now, our troops aren't based throughout the country, are they?
No, not uniformly.
Where are they largely?
Americans are predominantly in the south and the east. There is a substantial German contingent in the north, centered on Kunduz. There's
around 3,000 soldiers.
That's right. There is an Italian presence in the west around Herat. But large parts of the country have no meaningful foreign military presence.
And where are the Taliban and the terrorists and the insurgents?
For the last several years, Taliban activity has been concentrated in the south and east, which is one of the reasons why why American dispositions are what they are. The Taliban has been increasingly active in the north and the west, and especially there have been some much discussed incidents in which Germans have been killed, and German military action has killed innocent civilians as well as Taliban. In and around Kunduz, there's been an increase in Taliban activity around Herat, but it remains disproportionately in the south and the east.
Now, as we sit here, are we losing the war that we're waging for the stability of Karzai and the Afghan government?
I think clearly the security trends in the country are negative and have been so for several years. If those trends continue, I think we will lose the war.
Now, you were there this past June, isn't that correct?
Yeah, June and July.
June and July. And you, on the ground, you observed this evidence that we're losing the war. Can you just briefly tell us what some of the indicators were?
Well, violence is up, both against Afghan civilians and against Western forces. The number of districts in Afghanistan that are controlled by the Taliban is up. There are indicators that even in cities that we previously thought secure, like Kandahar, for example, that quiet, under-the-radar Taliban infiltration has been setting up at least an attempt to create a shadow government that exists in parallel to the official governance structure run by the Karzai government. These are all important and dangerous trends.
Now, after you returned from Afghanistan in September, you testified before the Congress and you said, among other things, quote, "For me, the balance of costs and risks suggests a war that is worth waging, but only barely. What is clearest is that neither the case for war nor the case against it is beyond challenge or without important counter-arguments." Mm-hmm. Now, you adhere to that view today, do you not?
Yes, I do.
You think the war is worth waging?
I do, but I think it's a close call.
And what are some of the counter-arguments that you were referring to?
Well, the central counter-argument is cost. I mean, the best way
Financial cost.
Financial, human, political.
What is it costing us now, financially?
Well, in financial terms, upwards of $30 billion a year.
$30 billion a year. So,
and but the financial cost is in constant change as the scale of our presence there increases.
So were we to surge, that would increase?
I think we could reasonably expect costs not unlike those that we saw in Iraq in the course of 2006 and 2007.
Well, we've spent $1 trillion in Iraq. Would you forecast we'd spend about $1 trillion in Afghanistan over, you've said it will take 10 to 12 years?
It's hard to know because the out years are notoriously hard to project.
Yeah.
But clearly it's a major financial investment, and that's a serious disadvantage to undertaking it.
And what about casualties? How are our casualties running in Afghanistan as opposed to Iraq?
Well, they're still substantially lower than they were in Iraq, either in 2006 or 2007. But as the tempo of combat operations increases, I think what we should reasonably project is that we'll reach casualty rates comparable to those that we saw in Iraq in 2007.
Now, you helped McChrystal with his assessment, and he's recommending to the president and to the country a surge of 10 to 40,000 troops. Would they go in immediately or as soon as possible or over some period of time?
As soon as possible is not immediately. They will necessarily be phased into the theater over time as they become available and as the theater logistical infrastructure expands to be able to accommodate them.
And the idea of a surge is we're subtracting at the same time we're adding, aren't we? Isn't that true? There's kind of a rotation.
Well, there will inevitably be a rotation. People will not be permanently deployed to Afghanistan. The sense of the word surge is normally that the troop level will increase and then subside fairly shortly thereafter. I don't think that's a sound expectation for Afghanistan. Eventually the troop count will come down. We don't plan to be there forever. But I think the idea that it will quickly return to something like what it is today is mistaken. I think it's more of a sustained commitment.
You and President Obama, you and General McChrystal are not that far apart. I mean, President Obama wants to a surge, it is said, of about 30,000. He said that we'll be there until he leaves office, which is presumably in his mind 8 years. And so you're at 10 years, he's at 8 years. You're at 40,000, he's at 30,000. There's not really much difference in the two positions, is there?
No, there isn't actually, and I think it's been interesting the degree to which the debate on Afghanistan has gradually converged in on something fairly close to what General McChrystal has proposed. If you go back to January, for instance, when the administration first began to take a serious look at Afghan policy, the alternatives they were considering were very different. I mean, at the one end, removing most or all of the American combat ground presence in Afghanistan and relying instead on drone-based counterterrorism in Pakistan. Other similarly radical proposals or substantial reinforcement to do integrated counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. The more radical of those alternatives have gradually fallen off the table to the point where the range of options apparently under active consideration by the president is now a tiny fraction of that larger universe of alternatives of January.
Well, no one's for banning the drone. McChrystal says he wants to expand the use of the drone in the southern and eastern parts of the country where terrorists are concentrated.
Well, that's right. And one of the more interesting features of this debate in the last 4 or 5 months, anyway, has been the degree to which people have said, McChrystalism is a terrible idea. We need something very different, and then propose to do at least a major part of what McChrystal is proposing to do.
Right.
Whether that be drone-based counterterrorism or training and advising Afghan troops or negotiating with the Taliban. These are all parts of precisely what General McChrystal is proposing. He proposes to do them together. Critics often propose to take one or another of the pieces of the thing out of the context of the rest and try and do it alone. But very rarely has anyone proposed doing something that is not, in fact, part of the McChrystal program.
Now, McChrystal learned at the feet of the master, General Petraeus, in Iraq. General Petraeus, I guess, and General McChrystal are experts in what's called counterinsurgency, which involves training indigenous forces so that they can provide security, and together with counter-terrorist activity. Now, counterinsurgency seems to be much more of a proliferated program than just counterterrorism, which is sort of hunting out terrorists wherever you can find them. And
that's right.
also, it's difficult to use the drone without human intelligence on the ground and without troops on the ground, isn't that right?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, people tend to think of these drones as wonder weapons of some kind. The drones are basically low-performance airplanes without a pilot in the cockpit. And in order for them to be effective, somebody has to tell them where the targets are. They don't have a magic Vulcan mind meld from 30,000 feet that tells them where
If they did, we would have gotten bin Laden a long time ago.
Indeed we would. And today, much of the information that the drones use to determine the location of targets comes from governments on the ground, and especially the Pakistanis. The heart of counterinsurgency, as opposed to counterterrorism, is counterinsurgency is about protecting the population in order to sustain a government. Counterterrorism is just about killing terrorists. If we do the one without the other, we run the risk of the government's falling. If the government falls, we lose the intelligence cooperation that government is providing, and the efficacy of the drones for killing the bad guys goes way down. It's very hard to use the one as a substitute for the other as a result.
So we have to prop up the government politically, really. That's part of a counterinsurgency strategy, as well as by forming a security guard so the government can't be physically overthrown. Now, Secretary Clinton, just this past Wednesday, went to Kabul. She was photographed with General McChrystal and with Ambassador Eikenberry. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And she and Eikenberry are smiling. Eikenberry opposes the surge, as I understand his position, former general. McChrystal doesn't look so happy. Do you get anything from their body language?
Well, during the Cold War, there was this great art of criminology and looking at the body language of people over watching the May Day parades. I've never been particularly good at that, right. So I'll defer to others on the psychological happiness scores of these three individuals.
Well, she spent 90 minutes alone with Karzai, according to reports. I mean, what's your take on her mission, and do you think it was successful?
Well, I hope what her mission was to assist in the process of getting governance reform out of the Karzai government in Afghanistan by providing a good cop to go along with the bad cops that the U.S. interaction with Karzai has been providing in manifold number lately.
Who are the bad cops?
Well, by all accounts, the bad cops include Ambassador Eikenberry. They include Special Envoy Richard Holbrooke. They apparently include the Vice President in his interactions with Karzai. We've gone from a Bush administration that was all good cop, all carrot, no stick.
He had a teleconference with Karzai once a week.
Yes, and believed that the man was a hero and a friend and that he should be supported and not coerced. And now we've
Now he's corrupt, he's a drug lord, he's on the take, and he's allied himself with corrupt criminal cronies. So what's the truth?
Well, I think the truth is that he's important elements of both. And that viewing him as only one and not the other is not going to get us where we need to go. I mean, if we need governance change in Afghanistan, which I believe we do and which the McChrystal report says we do, it's going to require changing the interest calculus of actors that are currently behaving in self-interested ways. That requires a creative use of carrots and sticks, and that means carrots and sticks. Not all stick, not all carrot. Not all good cop, not all bad cop. We need a mix of these things for this policy to work.
Okay, now we have the middle ground, somewhere between total pullout and McChrystal's surge. That's been advocated by such people as Richard Haas in articles and op-eds. But you say, and this is what you wrote in the New Republic, but there is no magic middle way between the McChrystal recommendation and total withdrawal. And counterinsurgency, less is not more. So you disagree with them. Do you think President Obama is going to be tempted toward this middle ground as a safer course, where you put in fewer troops, where you withdraw them, extract them as soon as you can, and it's really sort of a cover for a cut-and-run approach, isn't that right?
Well, I mean, I think everyone is attracted to the middle ground for understandable reasons. I mean, we have important interests, but not unlimited ones. I mean, given that, you would think it would be natural to find limited military means to pursue limited interests. So there's a natural appeal to this, in addition to its virtues of political triangulation, squaring the circle between Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill. The trouble is, when you look at them in their military substantive content, I don't think any of them are very likely to work. They're politically appealing, they're militarily impractical.
The light footprint was instituted by former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld.
Yes,
and the fact is, it didn't work, did it?
That's right. I mean,
that's why we're in the situation we're in today. Doesn't work, but then what do you make of this statement that the president made in the course of his recent Asian trip? He said, quote, "So my goal is creating a situation in which our footprint is smaller, and Afghan security forces can do the job of keeping their country together." So is he going for this light footprint idea, do you think?
As an end, that makes perfectly good sense. As a means, it does not. Clearly, what we're trying to create is a situation in which we can go the heck home.
You recognized in your congressional testimony that if we prop up Karzai and save the Afghan government, there's no assurance that Pakistan won't be overthrown as well. And conversely, if Kabul falls, there's no assurance that the Pacs can't clean their own house and put down the insurgency and save the nukes for democracy. Isn't that right?
That's right. One of the reasons why our interests in Afghanistan, though real and important, are limited is that the relationship between the stability of Afghanistan and the stability of Pakistan is real but imperfect. I mean, you could imagine a stable Afghanistan and Pakistan falling anyway if the Pakistani government doesn't put its own house in order and wage its own counterinsurgency properly. You could imagine chaos in Afghanistan, but stability in Pakistan if the Pakistani government does put its house in order and wage counterinsurgency properly. What instability in Afghanistan does is it increases the odds of failure in Pakistan. It does not predetermine it. That tendency of failure in Afghanistan to make things worse, but not one-stop shopping hopeless in Pakistan, is what means that we have interests there. But the fact that that relationship isn't an absolute guarantee, failure here leads to failure here, success here leads to success here, means that our interests have real limits to them.
But if you were to uncouple the two, We really have no national security interests in Afghanistan, isn't that right?
Very limited interest in Afghanistan if you uncouple the two, and no greater than we have in Yemen or Somalia or lots of other places where we're not deploying
And
68,000
so,
troops.
if our end game is to save Pakistan, why don't we press the Pacs to put down the insurgency? Why don't we enlist the Indians, the Chinese, other actors in the region to protect Pakistan from its insurgency?
If there were a way to do that and have it work, I would sign up immediately. The trouble is, when I look at the policy option menu for dealing with Pakistan directly, I don't see anything on it that looks very likely to me to succeed. We are politically radioactive in Pakistan right now. We are not going to deploy 68,000 U.S. ground troops to Pakistan to help them wage their counterinsurgency. You could imagine that we'll provide aid, training, assistance to help them instead of deploying American troops to do it for them. We have been providing aid, training, and assistance ever since 2001 to 2. It is routinely diverted to purposes other than those we intend, and I submit that it is going to continue to be diverted to purposes other than we intend.
I think we have to wrap up. I have a question for you. You can answer quickly. Should we cut and run in Afghanistan?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's a close call, but I think it's a bad idea.
Stephen Biddle, thank you for coming by. This has been really wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age, about national security, about the media, about modern digital gadgetry. For the digital age, I am Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.